right, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Taylor Edema. I'm a director in the product management group, focused on all things threat prevention on the platform, so IPS, IDS, anti-malware, anti-command and control, Wildfire, Autofocus, our relatively new threat intelligence service, our anti-malware integration with the Traps agent, pretty much anything threat prevention related. I'd be happy to talk with you at length about today, any questions you might have related to this content or just general topics. But today specifically, I was planning to sort of share with you some of the recent innovations we've had in 7.1, as well as some of the cloud updates we've made to the threat intelligence cloud, having to do with threat prevention, threat intelligence, and so on, and sort of dive into some of these topics in a little bit more detail. All right. So first off, what do we really mean by threat intelligence cloud? What are we talking about? A lot of you have no doubt seen that triangle several times, maybe many times. The triangle that we refer to as our platform for defeating the advanced adversary. And that platform consists of three principal components. The firewall, of course, is sort of Palo Alto Network's bread and butter, the start of all of it, really redefining and pioneering what a firewall should do in modern day, right? Restoring that default denial that we've sort of lost over the years, controlling traffic at application layer, and really restoring that positive security model, whitelist-based approach to traffic control from a network perspective. Along the way, we picked up the endpoint component. And this is for a very specific and very important reason, right? It's not just to go after additional market, right? Endpoint space is hard. It's different. It's very different from networking, of course. Justifying deploying an agent on an endpoint, you have to work very hard and really deliver a very key, interesting capability to get on an endpoint. So why did we do that? Well, for a very important reason. You just simply have to be on the endpoint and on the network. There's things you can do on the endpoint you just can't do reliably from a networking perspective and vice versa. You have to be where the action is, and a lot of the action happens to be on the endpoint. But furthermore, it's important for those two components to be talking to each other, to get fed from a central threat intelligence repository and send down information to the network component that can be acted upon from a networking perspective, and then send information to an endpoint agent that can be acted upon from an endpoint perspective. So for example, something like a firewall can take action based on IP address, domain, URL, patterns within packets, things that make sense to act upon from a wire perspective. The agent, conversely, can do very different things. We're not bound by network wire time. We're not bound by the oddities of various networking protocols or application layer protocols. We can freeze a process and check whether it's good or bad before we allow it to continue to execute. We can see how code actually looks in memory. We can see exploitation as it actually attempts to occur on the endpoint. These are things you just can't reasonably do from a networking perspective, and then there's things on the wire, vice versa. So what is this threat intelligence cloud? Well, there's a number of components. I've highlighted three here that we're going to talk about at length today, where we've got some cool new stuff coming out. But it consists of things like the content distribution network for all of the content updates that we perform on a weekly and daily basis, and now with Wildfire every 5 minutes, as you heard yesterday. It includes things like our global passive DNS network. It includes the three things you see here today: Wildfire, Autofocus, and PanDB. And so we'll take a look at these three components in particular and go through some of the recent innovations here. I've sort of provided somewhat of a mission statement for each of these, and we'll start to see how what we're doing in 7.1 and some of these recent cloud updates advance that mission. So Wildfire, for example, core mission, detect the bad, the unknown bad amongst a sea of unknowns, and do so across as many platforms, popular platforms as possible that are in use in our customers' environments, and get that intelligence back into the platform as quickly as possible. Right? We're not interested in just detecting and telling you something bad happened. We want to extract and exploit that information as quickly as possible, deliver that in the form of protections so that patient zero only happens once, and within 5 minutes everyone is protected. And that malware or that command and control infrastructure is now only useful to the bad guy for on the order of minutes. We think that really changes the conversation. Autofocus. adding context to attacks that are hitting our customers' networks. So it's not really good enough anymore just to block something bad and then pat ourselves on the back and move on, right? We want to know, what was that? Was it unique to me or my industry or the global customer community? Across the hundreds of millions of samples that Wildfire analyzes, was this IP address seen only one time for command and control? That seems pretty interesting. Let me go take a look at that. And let me collect these indicators, pivot on them, get more indicators, and maybe look internal to the network and see if there's any evidence of compromise. And so how do we better enable those types of workflows? We'll take a look at that today as well. And then lastly, PanDB. PanDB has been enabling safe access to the web since its introduction several years ago. It's been helping protect customers from exploit kits and other threats. Phishing now is front and center for us, and we'll take a look at some of the things we're doing in the anti-phishing space. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started first with Wildfire. I think you saw some version of this yesterday morning. This is a different look at related data, but slightly different, where we're looking at total objects processed by Wildfire. You sort of see this hockey stick pattern is pretty dramatic, and the thought and the technical expertise that goes into building the infrastructure here is just a modern marvel of our engineering team. You can see this tremendous growth recently, and it just is showing no signs of slowing down, is a result of several factors that are sort of compounding on top of each other. So you've got, of course, the organic customer count growth. You've got expansion within existing customers. You've got expansion of usage of the product within existing customers. Maybe they turn on additional file type support or new features in Wildfire that add to the volume that we're seeing. And then you've got the release of new features as well. So for example, going from just file-based static and dynamic analysis to full URL visitation in browsers within the sandbox. So for instance, our email link harvesting that we can do, if you turn that on, we'll take those URLs in emails, extract them, and pre-visit them to detect exploitation that might be behind those URLs. So those four factors start to compound on top of each other and produce data like this. And why do we say this? We're not bragging about customer counts. We're not bragging about files analyzed just for the sake of talking about it. I mean, it really is, scale is really a feature. It's almost in a sense crowdsourcing security. It gets better the more people participate in the ecosystem, especially now with the 5-minute updates. Anyone, anywhere in the world is hit with something, and within minutes, the malware, the command and control is not useful anymore for the adversary because we're able to detect and update that across our entire customer community. So we're, I think I missed a slide here. Another reason for that growth is that the mission of Wildfire is also expanding. So when we first launched Wildfire, it was primarily a network-attached sandbox, right? It was a service that was used by our firewalls. Our firewalls would carve out content on the network, drop them in the Wildfire environment, and try and detect the good versus the bad. This is still its primary mission, but along the way, we've collected quite a few new products and services that leverage Wildfire as its anti-malware capability. So going around the circle clockwise here, we've got Traps now, the agent on the endpoint. And Traps you can think of as having two primary missions. One is anti-exploit, and one is anti-malware. So anti-exploit, of course, is that malicious PDF or Flash object that comes down and exploits a vulnerability to run code locally. Traps does the anti-exploit capability completely locally native within the Traps application. But for anti-malware, it uses Wildfire behind the scenes for the anti-malware piece. So let's say they don't come in with a PDF or an Office document. Let's say they just come in with an EXE. It's an email attachment maybe that it's disguised as a PDF, but it's really an EXE. Or it's a USB stick that introduces an EXE into the environment. Whatever the case may be, you've convinced or socially engineered or tricked someone into just double-clicking that EXE. There's no exploitation required anymore. You've basically given the adversary permission to run their code. So what do you do in that case? Well, Traps is not doing anti-exploit now. It's doing anti-malware. And to do anti-malware, it will freeze that process, do a hash lookup against the cloud, Wildfire specifically, and ask whether it's a good or bad file. If it's an unknown, then Traps has the option of actually submitting that file for analysis, getting the results back, and then allowing execution to continue if it's a known safe file at that point. Next, Aperture. Aperture, I think most of you are familiar with by now, a SaaS security product that allows you to really regain control over your sanctioned SaaS application usage. So if you have a corporate Box account, for example, we can scan forwards and backwards in time, look for data that shouldn't be there at all, maybe inappropriately shared, but also malware. So we can send files to Wildfire, get a verdict back, and then alert you to malicious software that might be hosted on Box. We've seen several interesting examples of this being quite a useful attack vector where you've got users that have the thick clients that auto-mount the stuff, bring it into the environment, and it becomes quite a useful way to propagate where most people aren't really looking or paying attention. We've got a number of integrations that are really dependent to Wildfire to do something pretty innovative. So on the Tanium front, we've had the Tanium integration now for roughly 6 or so months, where Tanium, which is a very good endpoint management and configuration tool, also happens to be a very powerful endpoint query tool. And in the context of security, can be very useful and powerful IOC sweeper, indicator of compromise sweeper. You can sweep hundreds of thousands of nodes we've seen in minutes and get results back, so it's pretty powerful. The challenge is, what do you look for, right? So Tanium doesn't provide a feed. What are you actually going to use that capability for? And so what we've done with Tanium is the Tanium Central Manager can actually pull in your Wildfire logs from PanOS or Panorama, extract all the hashes, look up against the Wildfire Cloud through the Wildfire API, the full analysis report of each of those analysis jobs, parse out the indicators of compromise, and then auto-issue those as IOC sweeps across all the endpoints in the environment running the Tanium agent. It does this automatically, does it within minutes. It's quite a neat capability. So now you're going not only from Wildfire detecting a malware download event and telling you that that's bad, but also sweeping the entire network looking for signs of lateral movement of that tool or of that adversary. And then the most recent one that was announced a couple months ago was the integration with Proofpoint, where mutual Proofpoint Wildfire customers can actually take their Wildfire API key, drop it in the Proofpoint console, and that allows the Proofpoint Cloud MTA to use Wildfire for its attachment analysis, which is very useful for 2 reasons. One is we now get to leverage Tanium as an MTA that can hold on and sit onto that message until we give it the green light. So you get that true patient zero prevention from an email standpoint, which is arguably more useful than just doing it from a network session scanning standpoint, where if it's an unknown and we analyze it in Wildfire, we can't hold on to the email from a firewall standpoint. So Proofpoint acting as an MTA gives you that sort of message quarantine capability. But also, whenever we learn something about a file, we feed it into the rest of the platform, right? So it's not just about detecting a good versus bad attachment. When we detect a good versus bad, or a bad versus good attachment, that bad attachment, we want to, again, extract as much intelligence out of that as possible and feed that back into the firewall, into the traps agent. So for example, here was a bad attachment. It was an exploitive PDF attachment. Proofpoint will throw away the email, but we'll take all of that command and control and we'll feed it into your DNS and PanDB URL filtering engines. And we'll take an anti-malware signature and drop it into your AV so that that file or similar file can't ingress ever again through any protocol, not just email. It might come web next time or FTP, wherever we find it across any customer, we can block it there. And from a traps perspective, same story. If that file somehow lands on an endpoint somewhere, we can still prevent execution even from an endpoint perspective. Right? So it's all about leveraging that intelligence and exploiting it to the most of your capability. Next here is Cyber Threat Alliance, which some of you might have heard about before. The real quick story here is that we got together with some of our partners in the security industry and defined really what intelligence sharing should be across vendors in the modern era. This is not any run-of-the-mill clearinghouse of garbage samples. This is there's a high bar to entry to get into the Cyber Threat Alliance. We're looking for a minimum number, for example, of samples shared per day that are high-quality samples. In other words, not seen on VirusTotal, not seen on any of the other feeds, but very interesting stuff that we measure and keep track of on a day-to-day basis. And the idea here is that we want our customers to choose us for our products and what we do with the information, and not feel forced into a siloed view of the world and only know about what Palo Alto Networks knows, but feel comfortable with the products and the fact that we do have this sharing going on in the background. So we think that's pretty important. We're welcoming more and more participants, and there's actually quite a wait list to get into this organization now. And we're pretty excited about it. It's sort of our first step in really getting vendors to talk to each other and share actual high-value threat intelligence. Whoops. And then lastly, Autofocus. Autofocus. Any of you had a chance to go to the Autofocus dojo yesterday? Cool. Yeah, I heard there was like a waiting line around the corner. It was pretty intense. I think we need a bigger venue next year. But Autofocus had a really strong start out the door. Once you take a look at it and see what it can do for your SOC operators or IR teams, it's quite remarkable. The context that it's able to provide, the ultra quick pivoting from indicator to indicator type, the context that's providing, the Unit 42 tags that are in there that give you an idea of attribution where possible, or campaign, or grayware versus adware versus commodity threats versus national level stuff. So it's a very powerful tool, and we're really excited about it. The hook into Wildfire, of course, is that Autofocus is doing a full live ingestion of all Wildfire data into Autofocus to do what Autofocus does. So as a Wildfire customer, if you do a trial or take a look at Autofocus, you'll see all of your malware samples and all of the data associated with that is already there. But what we've done is we've taken a look at that from a statistical analysis standpoint and from a human threat research standpoint to try and give you an idea of uniqueness, of targetedness, and really put more of an intelligence angle onto it rather than what Wildfire focuses on, which is more the good versus bad determination when it's presented with an unknown. Right? So quick look at the whole ecosystem now. There's quite a lot of stuff hooking into Wildfire now. So that's what draws pictures like this, basically, is Wildfire being increasingly important to a number of our products and services. So let's take a look at some of the new things that we've rolled out recently or in the process of rolling out. So you've heard, I think, a high-level view of some of this on Tuesday morning with Lee's keynote. Wildfire 5-minute update interval is really starting to squeeze the adversary very hard in terms of the usefulness, the time scale of the usefulness of their malware and their C2 infrastructure. For those of you that have been with Wildfire since the beginning, when we launched in I think roughly August or September of 2011. It's undergone quite the transformation since then in terms of capability, scale, turnaround time for signature updates. When we started in 2011, it was just bundled as part of the daily AV feed that we still continue to have today. That's the threat prevention license feed. When we introduced the Wildfire subscription, which unlocked a whole bunch of new anti-exploit capability and also this new Wildfire feed, we branched off of the daily, and now we were hourly. And then we've continued to push that down to 30 minutes a year later, and then 15 minutes a year later. And then as of PanOS 7.1, we're now publishing on a 5-minute basis, and PanOS is checking in every single minute, actually. And so as always, these updates contain the anti-malware AV signatures and the domain-based command and control signatures. For URLs, those continue to get fed into the PanDB malware URL category. So the triad of subscriptions from a threat prevention standpoint to get the absolute most out of the platform from a threat prevention angle is absolutely threat prevention, Wildfire, and PanDB. PanDB, all of our URL-based threat intelligence gets dropped into that malware and phishing categories in PanDB. And a quick comment about the anti-malware signatures. We get this question a lot. What are those signatures based on? Are they hash-based, for example? And the answer to that is definitely not. Hashes are certainly useful for uniquely identifying content, uniquely identifying files. They're useful to trade around, to share information with people. They're useful from a signature standpoint in the sense that they're easy to produce. Anyone can produce them, and they're relatively easy to enforce. And that's why so many people use them. The downside is that you're locked into this perfect one-for-one matching scenario where any trivial modification to that content produces an entirely different hash, and then hash-based blocking really isn't that great after all. And so that's why every time we announce support for a new file type that we can block with our antivirus capability, it's actually, there's a lot of work under the hood there. We have to research the file format and develop a new AV signature format unique to that file type that meets our requirements. Our requirements are definitely you got to block the bad file you know about, preferably block a bunch of the variants that you don't know about, do so in a stream-based and efficient fashion where we could preferably detect within the first packet that that's the bad file we want to block, because then we can do the certain niceties like the block page in the browser, where if you can intercept and drop the file in the first packet, we can present that block page in the browser. So we don't have the luxury of proxying and building and storing this whole file and performing hashing or other operations across the file. We want to do super efficient, early file delivery stage type of matching, and so that's what we do with our AV signatures. So the advantage to that is that we might write one signature, and we've seen cases where tens of thousands of variants are blocked across the customer community with that one AV signature. Very, very powerful AV matching capability there. Next is OS 10 support. I think you saw kind of the preview of this yesterday. We'll be rolling this out in the very, very near future to our production Wildfire cloud. We're calling it a preview for the time being, just until we're comfortable in the quality of the turnaround time for signatures for Mac OS 10, but we expect that we'll be there very shortly. So essentially what this capability allows you to do is forward Mac OS 10 binaries to the Wildfire cloud, just like you would Windows executables. We're supporting the top 4 popular OS 10 binary file formats that are natively executable in Mac OS. Mach-O binaries, package, dimage, and .app bundles. Furthermore, you'll now also have the ability to have control over these file types with your file blocking profile as well. So they'll be added there to that list of file types that you can allow, alert, or block on from a file blocking standpoint. So in any cases where you might be doing, let's say, EXE blocking today or alerting today, you'd be able to do that now with the Mac binaries as well. So in certain scenarios, you're maybe doing outright blocking like email attachments or web downloads, for example. Or in certain sensitive environments, shutting down transfer of those high-risk file types where you wouldn't expect to see them. And wherever you do that for EXEs today, probably makes sense to do those for the Mac binaries as well. And as per usual, antivirus and anti-command and control signatures would be part of the content updates that you receive as a result of sending these files for analysis to the cloud. Typically, when we announce new file type support in Wildfire, we like to turn that on in content and not require a PanOS upgrade. In this case, we are requiring a 7.1 upgrade because it turns out that several of these file formats are just very, very difficult to parse out and identify reliably. And so we have had to update software to be able to allow us to do that. So there is a 7.1 dependency here in the firewalls. And then the third thing I wanted to touch on with Wildfire that we've been hard at work at is enhancements to static analysis and reliable detection of variants of known or commodity malware. So a quick background on this. Vast majority of not only malware-based attacks, but exploitive document-based attacks, there's almost always some native code that eventually gets dropped and run somewhere. Whether it be for the initial intrusion or maybe later stage in the attack, even for non-PE-based initial intrusions like Office documents, for example. More often than not now, these Office documents actually don't even exploit now very often. They actually just have macros. Macros made a huge comeback last year. Those macros run, and they just reach right back out to the web, pull down a PE, drop it, and run it. Super easy. Anyone can do it. Even if you couldn't figure it out, there's kits that do this with one button clicks now. So it's just a huge attack surface now for the bad guys. So there's a PE there somewhere. And even for the commodity stuff, you'd see that PE repacked, obfuscated hundreds of thousands of times sometimes with all this more commodity stuff. Now, when you're analyzing variants, sometimes you might be right, sometimes you might be wrong with the verdict. In other words, if a file, all it does is it drops and then reaches home to command and control before it does anything bad and then starts doing bad things, well then the detection logic is sort of dependent on the command and control being up. And if you have command and control that's not up all the time, it's not reliable, or it's being moved from bot to bot in a botnet C2 environment, or they just turn their C2 on and off to try and evade detection, that can cause difficulties in detection from a sandboxing perspective. Now, before, that didn't really matter. When we were just talking about our firewalls, Wildfire actually only had to find that bad thing once, because when we find it, we release the AV signature, and then we can block all those variants in a lot of cases. And then our customers never even see those files anymore because we're dropping them at ingress time, and Wildfire never even sees most of those variants because they're just dropped. Things have changed now. We've got the traps agent. And that traps agent, once there's a file on the desktop, or on the endpoint, let's say it didn't come through the network, or they were off network and the firewall didn't see anything, and you've got this file and it's executing, and Traps needs to find out whether it's good or bad. This is not the anti-exploit case. This is just the anti-malware case where we've got a binary that's about to start up. It'll do a hash-based query to Wildfire. And if we haven't seen it before, it'll reanalyze it. So that's causing reanalysis of a variant we might already know about, but now we're relying on this dynamic analysis to find out whether it's good or bad. And if we're not 100% or close to it, then you have potential misdetections on the endpoint, which we don't want. And so we've invested tremendously in a combination of machine learning, code block analysis, static analysis techniques to get reliable and accurate detections on all variants of commodity and more common malware, not just the ultra slick national level stuff, APT, 0 day, et cetera. But even the commodity stuff now is becoming kitted, turned into kits that anyone can actually create polymorphic, fairly sophisticated stuff that looks unique every single time, but it's really the same thing. And so having this combination of both the really world-class static and dynamic analysis to get that reliable, close to 100% detection for even the commodity stuff is very important, especially from a Traps perspective. So it's sort of an evolution of the mission of Wildfire to support that. Switching gears real quick to Autofocus now. So Autofocus is just a very, very cool capability. A few of you guys went to the dojo yesterday. It allows users to not only find the good versus the bad, but now take a step back, look at the broader context, find out, is this commodity malware? Is this a national level campaign? Am I the only one to see this? Is my industry targeted? Is this just sort of a spray and pray operation? And then pivot to artifacts that can actually be actionable for you. So you might not be able to do anything from let's say an endpoint scanning perspective. Maybe a list of hashes isn't terribly useful for you. But you look up those same hashes in Autofocus, and you can pivot to their associated network-based indicators like IP addresses, URLs, domains, things like that you can look up in our logs or anyone else's logs that's got any kind of network sensing capability. So that becomes an actionable piece of intelligence. So pivoting from the not so useful to the very useful is one of the key use cases for Autofocus. So we've had a lot of great early success with it, and we're really excited about the future of Autofocus. And one of the things, here's some fan art that someone sent to me. They really love their Autofocus, so they created an animated GIF for me there. But one of the things we wanted to work on is how do we really tie together Autofocus with our network and endpoint capabilities, with third-party intelligence providers and consumers, and really start to get this ecosystem talking to each other. Even if that ecosystem is bigger than Palo Alto, right? So there are 4 capabilities that we're rolling out with 7.1 and the associated cloud updates that get us closer to that goal. And we'll walk through them one at a time real quick. But one is starting to integrate Autofocus directly with PanOS Panorama. Second, support for open standards like STIX to get more free flow of information using accepted standards. Third, expanding our PanOS dynamic block list to include other indicator types that you can now feed directly into PanOS for local blocking. And then fourth, an open source tool we announced yesterday called MindMeld that allow you to really take arbitrary systems and connect them to other systems and start to really automate some pretty neat workflows. So let's take a look at these one at a time. First is the Autofocus integration with PanOS. So as soon as we released Autofocus, almost immediately we identified several extremely common workflows that made total sense, right? Everyone's in Autofocus. They're responding to an incident or looking up an artifact. Maybe it's something we already blocked, but now you want to learn more about that incident. and they look it up in autofocus, and they start to collect almost like a shopping cart of indicators, basically. And the first thing you want to do with those, of course, is check, have I seen any of this stuff? Is this somewhere else in the network that I wasn't already aware of, or that maybe wasn't blocked for some reason? And so they'll take this indicator set, and they'll do manual copy and paste, for example, into our log viewer, and then have to go log database to log database. So check the traffic log, check the threat log, check the URL log, to see if there's any evidence of these artifacts that you're looking for. And then we saw workflows in the other direction too. So someone's in PanOS now, and you're going through your logs, and you see something that looks a little interesting or odd or out of place. Maybe it's an IP address you didn't expect, or email sender or subject line, or something that you want to just take a quick peek at and sanity check. And so they'll take that IP address and they'll copy and paste into autofocus and try and get some context around that artifact within autofocus. So how can we improve on this and tie these two together to make that a little bit more seamless? And so with 7.1, we've got this integration now where if you're within autofocus and you're collecting this list of indicators, you can now not only search locally within the autofocus application, but do what's called a remote search and send that artifact list to your local PanOS or Panorama instance and do searching within your own data immediately. And furthermore, do a search in what we call the new unified log viewer in 7.1, which combines all of the logs into one viewport so that you're not having to do the same search across multiple log types or log databases. Okay. And then we'll go in the opposite direction as well. So if you're in PanOS and you're looking at an IP address, for example, in a traffic log, you can hover over that. A context-sensitive menu pops, and then for autofocus, and then we pop up a quick sort of at-a-glance view of context that autofocus is able to provide around that artifact. So if it's an IP address, let's say, we'll show any related samples that have maybe come from or phoned home to that IP address, how much was malware versus benign, any affiliated domains we've got from our passive DNS network that's associated with that IP address. And if any of that looks at all remotely interesting, you hit the link and you jump into the full-blown autofocus application to get the entire view and then continue to search and manipulate data within the autofocus application. So tying together that workflow from both directions allows you to do some pretty neat things in a much more seamless fashion. Second is sticks. So there's been a lot of talk about sticks, taxi over the last couple of years. It's a fairly mature standard. It's got all the right things in there. It can be a little bit verbose at times, but they've definitely got all the research and basis covered here. And it seems like everyone's sort of still waiting around to see, okay, who's jumping in and what can we really do with this? FSISAC and Soltra have definitely been leading the charge. We're seeing more and more uptake now of sticks to get that automated sharing of threat intelligence. And we're happy to embrace sticks as the standard to do this. And so we're with the new API in Wildfire, able to export data natively in Sticks 1.1.1 format. It's fully validatable by a Sticks validator. And so you're able to take that information, and it's actually got embedded MAEC and SciBox objects as well. So these are very nicely defined schemas, sort of sub-schemas for defining malware behaviors and network-based observables, cyber observables, and be able to export that and deliver it to another tool that can consume Sticks data. Third item, PanOS. So when we released what we called at the time dynamic block lists, which allowed the firewall to pull an internally hosted list of IP addresses that you can then pull into your config and start blocking or alerting on within minutes, everyone loved it, and then immediately asked, okay, now I want to do this for domains and URLs, which of course makes perfect sense. So we're happy to extend this capability now to include domains and URLs, and this is what it looks like in PanOS. So you've got three different types of what we now call external block lists. We've got the dynamic, we've got the domain list here, IP list here, and URL list here. And they're enforced in different areas, as you'd expect, right? So the IP list continues to be enforced at the firewall policy level. So they represent themselves as address objects in your firewall rule base. The domain lists are enforced in the anti-command and control, or what we call anti-spyware profile, where all the threat DNS stuff happens today. So that you'll start to see custom lists show up there if you define them here. And that allows you to do block, alert, allow, or sinkhole, which is a capability unique to enforcing this at the DNS resolution stage, right? So you might have malware that does web-based command and control, but it might not be web-based. It might be IRC. It might be just raw sockets, just communicating over whatever proprietary protocol they want to invent. So URL-based blocking isn't always 100% reliable in cases like that. However, if they're doing a domain resolution to get to their command and control, which is quite common, we can shut them down at resolution stage. So any domains you put in the DNS list or in the domain list get enforced at DNS resolution time, which means we can allow alert block at DNS resolution and also sinkhole at DNS resolution. So we can take that domain and forge a response back, pointing the malware to some IP address that you specify, which number one will shut down the C2 channel. Number two can help you identify more quickly who is the actual infected host, because now any host that contacts or generates a traffic log to this dummy IP address, or it might be a honeypot you've got internally, is automatically suspect, right? So in cases where we are north of your local resolver, we would be blind to the endpoint that resolved the domain until you set up sinkholing, and now we can see who resolved that domain because they'll generate a network log to that sinkhole IP address. And then the URL list, of course, is enforced as part of the URL profile. So any custom URL lists that you define show up as custom categories in the URL filtering profile, and that's where that is enforced. So you can do the same allow, alert, continue page, block page, et cetera. And then lastly, how do we tie all this together now? So there was a tool that was announced at the keynote yesterday called MindMeld, which is going open source, which we're pretty excited about. It allows you to take all of these components now and actually get them to start talking to each other. So there are other sessions, I think yesterday and today, that go into this in a bit more detail that I'm going to cover here. You can certainly view the material offline once this is all posted as well. But the summary version is you define input nodes, an aggregation or business logic layer, and then output nodes. Your input nodes are written, of course, to talk natively to whatever's producing this intelligence and how to consume that. And then you define some custom logic here that might prioritize or separate or aggregate and dedupe, things like that. And then you define custom output nodes that then speak the native language of whatever system you're trying to send this to on the consumer side. So a very simple workflow might be, and this is one that's already built with the nodes and data types that we've already defined in the open source version, is hooking up Autofocus directly to these external dynamic lists in PanOS. So for example, if you're working an incident in Autofocus and you start collecting an indicator set, you can add that to a labeled list, what we call an export list in Autofocus. And MindMeld can actually be monitoring that export list and pulling in the artifacts you have in that export list, automatically aggregating them, and then sending them to some internal web server you might have that's hosting this as a list of IPs or domains or URLs, and then feeding that into then a PanOS that's configured to harvest that list and bring it in. So you're going from a SOC operator, for instance, using Autofocus and collecting bad things to look out for or to block, to automatically reprogramming the network capability to block that or alert on that without even touching PanOS. And by the way, there are a number of predefined input and output nodes that we already have that sort of work out of the box. And then, of course, as an open source tool, you can go wild and create all kinds of custom logic. One other example might be you've got, let's say, 4 IP reputation feeds or something like that. You're pulling an IP-based block list from various sources, but you've got some that are, and they're all tagged with some severity level, some confidence level. And you want to export that as maybe a high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, where you're doing blocking up here, but you're only doing alerting down here. That's another example of something you can do at this aggregation layer that defines what you're doing with the information when you push it to someone that can actually consume and take action on it. Okay, and then switching gears to last topic for today is credential theft and abuse. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart lately. We've been really taking a renewed focus on this problem since it is a pretty pervasive problem. For all of the talk and the attention that gets paid to malware and exploits and ODays and so on and so forth, it's much easier just to ask a user for their creds and then log into the network with those creds. or to land on a machine, dump locally, cache creds, and then move throughout the network with a privileged account, for example. And so we're seeing evidence of this more and more. It's becoming more and more of an issue, and we're taking a close look at creative solutions to some of these problems, some of which are available today and some of which we're taking a look at in the future. But the way we think about the problem, we break it into two separate problems. There's the theft side, and then there's the credential abuse side. So how they're actually stolen, which might be through external phishing, local credential theft, if you can get malware running on the machine and then do local credential dumping or key logging. It might be through dumped credentials on the dark web, so on and so forth. And then on the abuse side, what do they actually do with these creds? VPN in, go to more sensitive areas on the network, whatever the ultimate objective is, and how they use the credentials to get there. So, and these are some stats from Verizon DBIR that you might have seen before, which are actually pretty surprising, or pretty shocking when you look at the implication of this. I mean, even for an extensively trained user, where everyone's vigilant, you're doing the training, you're doing the dry runs of phishing attacks, even then, 5% failure rate, which really means that you don't actually have to try a whole lot before you catch someone on an off day and they're just not paying attention and they get a cred. So this is sort of the scenario that we're dealing with. We're handling it on two fronts. There's how do we prevent the theft, and then how do we prevent the abuse? On the abuse side, there's other sessions that cover what we're doing in Global Protect to better enable use of multi-factor and certificate distribution, things like that. It's a separate session. What I'll focus on is more on the theft side and what we're doing in PanDB to help address this problem. So one of the things that we do with Wildfire already is if you turn this particular capability on, we can actually harvest URLs inside of emails and pre-visit them and look for signs of exploitation or malware behind those URLs. What we're doing now with the latest version of PanDB and Wildfire is we're not only looking for exploitation, we're looking for signs of phishing pages behind those links. Very often these phishing pages you lure the victim to the phishing page through a phishing email. So if we can detect that page is phishing, get that into the phishing category in PanDB as quickly as possible. Today it's 30 minutes. Of course, we'll continue to try and push that to a shorter and shorter turnaround time. And we can block the user from even getting to that page in the first place. But we don't want to just do the URLs that are in emails. We've also now started to feed in all unknown URL lookups. So for those of you that are somewhat familiar with how PanDB works, right, there's not really a local database. It's a cloud-based service. There's a local cache, but anytime a new URL is looked up by a client, or a client visits a new URL, the firewall then does a cloud query to get the category for that URL and all related URLs. If we've never seen that page before, we've never crawled it before, it comes back as an unknown, and then we eventually do crawl it, and we categorize it based on content. What we've changed now is we're not just categorizing based on content, we're also now categorizing based on detection of some of these indicators of phishing. So it's very common where we'll see, it's why we advise to block unknown if at all possible, is more often than not that there tends to be bad news there. Why is this site unknown, never before seen? And so sometimes it's just something that hasn't been indexed yet. Other times it's malware command and control, or malware delivery, or exploit kits. And then other times still it's a phishing page where someone has set up maybe a dynamic DNS domain. It points to wherever the phishing page is hosted, and then that's how a phishing page is delivered to the end user. So if we can detect that there's a phishing page behind that URL, we'll again add that to the phishing category of PanDB so you can enforce it there. OK, that's all the material I had prepared for today. I'll open it up for questions at this time. Anything threat prevention related at all. Doesn't have to be necessarily even restricted to the 7.1 content. Any questions at all related to threat prevention, Wildfire, Autofocus, PanDB, anything at all? Or run into you.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about that Cyber Threat Alliance? Who else is involved in that?
Sure. So founding members are Palo Alto Networks, Symantec, McAfee, and Fortinet, I believe. To date, we've got, I think, around 12 members or so, with a waiting list that's multiple times that. And it's just a question of getting around to evaluating the quality of their contributions that they're signing up to make, and all the logistics associated with that. So already there's quite a substantial amount of quality sharing going on, and that's what it's all about, is the quality sharing. Anyone can pull together a list of a few thousand garbage samples on a daily basis. It's not that hard. What we're looking for is something that's a true contribution that no one else has seen before. They happen to be in a position to see it, and now they want to share that with the broader community to help everyone be more protected. Yeah. That speaks very well to ultimately where autofocus is going, actually. So with autofocus, we're getting into a position where, based on what we're seeing in your particular industry, let's say, there are recommendations or conclusions or things that we might be able to point you to that would be maybe more relevant for you versus someone that's in a completely unrelated vertical, let's say. Now, you can do that today. It's just that it's more of an interactive process where you're issuing queries or you're looking things up, and you can see the relative difference between what is hitting you versus what's hitting everyone else. Now, you could say, let's take that and turn that into a more proactive feed or a notification of service of some sort, which is potentially interesting. That in that form does not exist today, but it's something that we'd be taking a look at. If and when we go down that path, though, we'd want to make sure that there's a value add, that there's something there that no one else can really deliver. When we see sort of industry-focused feeds that are produced by sort of the quote-unquote intel vendors, it's typically in a curated fashion that's not necessarily poised to adapt as quickly as what's really happening on the ground, where it's more of a prepared report format or things of that nature. What autofocus allows us to do is, we basically have this live ingestion of what's actually happening. And this is not honeypot data. It's not human speed data. This is live sensor data in customer environments where they're actually seeing true attacks coming after them, right? So if we take that and we can perform analysis on that and then convert that into more of a proactive alerting, that would be how we'd approach that, I think. But, yeah.
If we have an unknown URL, you said here, do I need Wildfire to get the updates in 30 minutes? Is it phishing?
Yeah. Question is, do you need URL filtering to get the Wildfire subscription? So PanDB is providing the categorization. Wildfire is feeding intelligence into some of the categories of PanDB. So so with just PanDB alone, you're able to do all the category-based control, including malware and phishing. But if you get hit with a unique attack that no one else sees, Wildfire needs to be there to see that and then add the URLs we can extract from that event back into PanDB to protect you locally. If you don't want to contribute anything to Wildfire, you don't have to, and you're still protected using PanDB and threat prevention from an antivirus standpoint and a URL filtering standpoint against what everyone else sees. But without contributing to Wildfire, you just wouldn't be in a place where you could defend yourself against what you yourself sees that no one else sees.
Just a quick question here to your right.
Oh.
You said that your time to protection with Wildfire was around 5 minutes, down from 24 hours in 2011. Do you have any idea what the baseline is for your competitors? And is there any clarity that we can get to view the comparison between you and your competitors?
Sure. It's sort of a mixed bag. So we see either updates much slower or they're on par with Wildfire from a timeline standpoint, but not from a signature capability standpoint. So some vendors have turnaround time on the order of hours or on the hour or roughly that order of magnitude. There's one vendor that is able to check for updates very quickly on the order of minutes, similar to what we do, but it's just a hash list, right? So it's not the AV that we have, and it's not the command and control blocking that we have. So I wish it were a simpler answer to say we're the fastest. We are the fastest in most all cases, but for instance, there's a particular vendor that updates roughly on the same rate that we do, but it, like I said, it's just a hash list, so we think that there's a significant quality difference there. Okay, all right, thank you all very much.